welcome to the second episode of my podcast. I need to come up with a better introduction than this one, but I'm very excited to speak about Katharsis today, and I'm going to kind of reiterate and elaborate on older videos that I've made about Katharsis that most of my followers have probably not seen. So, Katharsis is a topic which I find endlessly interesting not least because it's something that we undergo every day. And it is something that we have to undergo continuously. We have no choice but to undergo it continuously. Like, as civilized human beings, who live in a human world, who have a certain standard which we hope to ascend to, a standard of being which we hope to ascend to. And I find that every time I do lots of purification, sometimes simultaneously different forms of purification of Katharsis, there's always a very unsubtle transformation that takes place. And maybe this is just my disposition, but I always see a God. I always say this because it's true, but every time I do a ton of purification, I have a theophany, a vision or an experience of a God. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because what even is Katharsis? Of course, it's a beautiful, gorgeous Greek word, ancient Greek word, and it comes from the verb of to cleanse, to purge, to purify, kathairein. And interestingly, it's also used in the sense of a philosophical, argumentative purification or clarification. So you find this in Plato, for example, when Plato clarifies the presuppositions before he moves on to the next point. And so, in a way, Plato is purifying and clarifying his philosophical argument in his text, but I'm not going to speak about Plato today. I'm speaking from a much more kind of subjective perspective, which is what I think real philosophy is anyway. Real philosophy, I think, is in the 21st century is synthesizing your own perspective with your own subjectivity. Anyway, so to be clean, to be katharos or kathare if you're female, or katharos, to be clean means to be purified. And I always say this. I always word it in the sense that it is making contact with an impurity, recognizing it, validating it, scrubbing it away, releasing it. And that's what it means to do katharsis. So as you can imagine, there's millions of ways to do it. There's millions of ways to purify, to cleanse, to purge. And I had an initial idea of discussing briefly the emotional purification by vicarious experience, that which is identified in the poetics as the tragic katharsis, that which you experience when you're watching a tragedy on the stage, in the drama. And I have a few things I'd like to say about it, because it's very interesting. I think it pertains broadly to the human experience. But then I'm going to kind of transition into a different discussion about it, which is kind of just me forging my own path. But I have some things to just clarify, to purge, to clarify and cleanse before we get to that. So there are several different meanings of katharsis. Of course, there is this emotional, vicarious experience on the stage when you see the character of a Greek tragedy, or any tragedy, any character in any tragedy, any drama, undergoing a release, an expression or release of an impurity, an emotional impurity. That feeling that you experience as an audience member can be a form of katharsis. But I don't want to talk about the katharsis that you experience as an audience member. I want to speak about the katharsis that you experience as the character. Then we have the more boring, the psychotherapeutic, not the more boring, I shouldn't say that. I'm just saying that to be edgy, but yeah, the psychotherapeutic definition understanding, which is that it's the process of reliving an emotion, re-experiencing the memory or the idea of an event which was the first cause of an emotion, and then eliminating it, again, making contact with the impurity, stripping it away, releasing it. I believe, before we get into this, that I have in the past, and my views are always evolving and changing, but I have personally identified 3 phases of the theurgic process, which I have mentioned. The first is katharsis, the second is theurgy, the third is theophania, the vision of the God, the experience of the God. So this is katharsis, this is the purification. Theurgy is the divine work, the divine ritual, which takes place after the purification or concurrently with the purification. And then there is the theophania, the vision of a God or the experience of a God. And of these 3 phases, I believe that katharsis is the most difficult to teach. Theurgia is the least difficult to teach, and that theophania is absolutely unteachable. So I have 10 pages of notes here about katharsis. Before we make a sacrifice, before we do a divine work, before we give an offering or a sacrifice to a God, it is Homeric that we should cleanse ourselves. Before we pray, before we offer a prayer to a God in a formal, theurgic way, it is Homeric to cleanse oneself. It is Homeric to wash one's hands so that we can approach the God as closely to our pure selves as possible. Of course, we are humans. We accrue experience. We accrue trauma. We accrue quote-unquote impurities. And by the way, I don't mean any of this in a moral or ethical sense. I just mean that we accrue experience. We accrue life. And so the concept of moral purity is not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about a purity of experience. Now, there's an interesting complicating aspect of katharsis as it is practiced in this theurgic tradition which follows Pythagoras. The Pythagoreans were famously very concerned with cleanliness. From the golden verses, just off the top of my head, they have many forbidden foods, reflecting that it contributes to cleanliness, that the food that you eat contributes to cleanliness. Also, I remember very vividly a kind of recounting, a kind of, why do I want to say a hadith? A Pythagorean hadith, okay, that Pythagoras was asked how much purification a certain woman should do who had many sexual partners before she could enter the temple. And he responded that there was no amount of purification that she could do to enter as an unpolluted body. Now, of course, 21st century, 2023. That's obviously not, again, this isn't, for me, katharsis, it's not a moral issue. It's not an issue of moral pollution or moral purification. It's much more one-to-one. What is the pollution, the trauma, the damage that you have accrued that has harmed you? And how can you strip it away? How can you approach the God as a pure body? And I've spoken many times about how there are many levels to Katharsis. There are the ranging from the most superficial level of the physical cleansing of the body, right? The cleansing of the vessel which has received the pollution, all the way down to very deep, dark, underworld, chthonic Katharsis. This Katharsis which occurs like in Hades. Like I'm thinking Odysseus when he travels to the underworld. That is a kind of deep chthonic purification. But the idea of the theurgic life is that theurgic life is peppered by many acts of Katharsis every day. So let us consider the Pythagorean akousmata. That is the hadith, by the way. The Pythagorean hadith were the akousmata. They were the thing. They were like these kind of like anecdotal things heard by the Pythagoreans. Anyway, so they aimed at preservation of purity, an attunement of the individual with the divine and the human worlds. The particular attention is paid to speech, food, clothing, and behavior, and these are crucial. So purification or purity paid to speech, food, clothing, and of course behavior. So anyway, the idea that Katharsis is a methodical process is very ancient. We don't really know how ancient people thought necessarily to what like nuanced degrees Pythagoreans thought. We have very little about the Pythagoreans just generally. But as far as we know, the ancient processes of religious purification were rigid and very methodical, even of course preceding the Pythagoreans. In Homer, of course, I've said this before, sacrifice is officiated correctly only after one has cleansed oneself, usually the hands, but often the whole body, and anointed oneself also before like a feast, usually before a sacrifice, but usually before a prayer, the hands are washed. Right? So I initially wanted to discuss Katharsis in a tragic sense. I'm just now going to mention a few elements of tragedy that I find very fascinating. Then I'll move into more of like an iamblican understanding of Katharsis, and then honestly my favorite part of the explication is my own kind of thoughts, just my own synthesis of thoughts about Katharsis. But and by the way, this is going to be a very kind of like, there will be many tangents, many detours that will be taken, and that's honestly the goal. That's kind of the form of this medium. So anyway, in tragedy, Katharsis occurs when a character has encountered rather plainly, with unequivocal clarity, the truth. Usually the truth is revealed. It is something which is unhidden. It's usually the truth about themselves, or very interestingly, what is going to happen or what has happened. And it happens at this Katharsis, it happens at really different paces in different tragedies, and I'll give context. In Oedipus, Tyrannos, we see a kind of flash of Katharsis when Oedipus is more or less realizing the truth all at once, and his contact with the impurity of his own behavior, of his own actions, right? That he's like slept with his mother and murdered his father, his biological mother, his biological father. His contact is like brief and it's immediate, and now he knows who he is. He knows at once who he is. And paradoxically, he's freed by the knowledge of himself in his own self-injury. Of course, he blinds himself, but it comes also at the great expense of his mother's suicide, the suicide of Jocasta. And the Katharsis of Oedipus has been written on ad nauseum. I want to focus briefly in my tragic discussion of Katharsis on the incredibly interesting Katharsis of Cassandra. I want to bring special attention to the Katharsis of Cassandra in Aeschylus. Just for context, usually in Agamemnon, the play Agamemnon, usually people spend a lot of attention and a lot of time on the lines by Clytemnestra when she's murdering her husband. She confesses these feelings of pleasure as her husband's blood is spattering against her face. And she says that in that moment that dew falls on me as the gods' spring rains fall and bless harvest back to the long parched earth. And this is definitely a very evocative image. These lines of Clytemnestra have also been written about ad nauseum. I want to bring special attention to Cassandra because what she experiences in terms of catharsis is unlike anything I've seen in tragedy. She experiences this extremely piecemeal, strange fragments of drawn out visions of what is to come, what is to happen. She's putting the pieces all together in the moment, and she's struggling to explain it to the chorus so that it's taking even longer to come to like a mutual understanding of what the impurity even is, of what she's even talking about, until she finally exclaims, Agamemnon, he's the one you'll see dead. After which, of course, the chorus is like scandalized. They're in denial. They don't want to believe it. And then Agamemnon is cut down off stage, and Cassandra walks calmly to her own death. Now, libation bearers and Eumenides are even more drawn out catharsis, but I thought that Cassandra's is remarkable in its structure. It's so complex, like it's so Delphic. It feels like it transcends the linearity of time, because it kind of does, like in its marriage of the past, present, and future, which is something that we don't always get in other catharses, namely Euripides' Heracles, where characters are coming to terms with the horrors that have taken place, or like Oedipus. But this one is just so fascinating, like again, the transcendence of the linearity of time. And forget discussion of it from a literary perspective, from the perspective of craft of the language, but in terms of a spiritual understanding of catharsis, the catharsis of Cassandra, as she is illuminating the past about the house of Agamemnon, right? The past of cannibalism in the house of Atreus, the present, what's happening off stage, which is that Clytemnestra is slaying her husband, and then what is to happen to her, to Cassandra herself, which is that she is then to be slain. It's a masterful kind of like psychological reflection of this state of catharsis that we enter into often. Now, of course, there's also, and perhaps I should have mentioned this first, but I don't think it strictly adheres to like the tragic element of catharsis. But of course, there's like the purifying fire of Achilles, of the wrath of Achilles in Iliada, which can be seen as a form of cleansing and purifying, though. But at the same time, it's totally not. Like there's seriously ethical problems with this, and I'm using ethical here because Homer doesn't discuss it in ethical terms, but like I would say that Achilles like staining his own hands with the blood of Hector and infringing upon religious impiety by dismembering him with his chariot is kind of grounds for some kind of ethical judgment, which is why I'm trying to actually avoid the instance of purification of the wrath, like the purification by fire of Achilles, which is like by far the most kind of famous of purification by fire, at least in the ancient Greek literature. But anyway, as I said, these are more dramatic tragic catharsis, but they're extremely useful models to have of ancient archaic thought. So now I think that we can kind of turn more to the modern theurgian, the modern human being, the modern listener who's interested in catharsis. And we're very lucky that we don't necessarily have to officiate catharsis through these explicitly very violent, often homicidal, suicidal means. We don't even need to go that far into antiquity to find out what we want to know, really, because, there was a man, a blessed man who came to earth and put forth a much more calm, serene, but a very rigorous, very challenging method of human knowledge, whose writings then give way to our beautiful theurgic practitioners, the Neoplatonists. Of course, his name was Plato. And he and Pythagoras and Proclus and Iamblichus, and even the composer of the Orphic hymns, among many, many, many others, they taught us how to avoid incurring too much pollution, or miasma. The word is miasma in Greek. Pollution onto our souls. And the concepts and the practices of cleansing are important to each of them in their own unique ways. And of course, Plato's dialogues are like a very sophisticated form of cleansing, as in their attention to clarity, as I already mentioned. But anyway, there are many methods of these ancients that are already very well known, very well documented. But of course, the physical washing of oneself is always primary. The abstaining of certain foods, of abstaining of meat, celibacy, abstaining from sex, which is, of course, it's not really seen in the same way as the Christian concept of like sinful sex, but sex in the ancient Greek pagan world was absolutely by no means divorced from the idea of a pollutant if it were to take place outside of religiously sanctioned bounds. So I'm speaking again mainly of the Pythagoreans, but we can speak more about sex as a pollutant later in maybe a different podcast. I'm definitely planning on making a long podcast, if not a series, on kind of like spirituality, paganism, sex, sexual intimacy, relationships, romance, and eros. But anyway, that's for another time. But there are many other examples. We have the wearing of certain garments, like white garments, clean garments. And you see this even in Homer. By the way, there's residue of all of these really explicitly acknowledged forms of catharsis. There's residue of it in Homer. So in Homer, when, for example, Penelope or Odysseus or Telemachus, or any of the number, even Menelaus, when he finds out of the death of his brother Agamemnon, when they cry, when they are portrayed in Homer weeping, it's a form of catharsis. It's a form of relief, of release, of purification, of cleansing, and I love all of the scenes which take place in the bedchamber of Penelope, because she's often weeping over the absence of her husband, Odysseus, and usually the goddess Athena sometimes will come in some form and try to comfort her, and then she'll like take a bath and she'll put on like clean clothes, fragrant. Homer calls them fragrant garments. And it's just such a beautiful, ancient scene, an ancient portrayal of the cleansing, of the catharsis, both at the emotional, conscious emotional level and at the more superficial level. And this is all well attested. And then as we advance further into the Hellenic, the Hellenistic sources, the burning of herbs is attested by Iamblichus. And interestingly, the burning of herbs is itself a theurgic act and also a catharsis, also a purification, because the fire purifies the herb. It kind of like transfigures it into a more pure form. So, broadly speaking, also kind of at more of the level of speech and behavior, the denial of this of the indulgent impulse to curse an enemy or to do evil upon an enemy. Those are the behaviors that they would have avoided so as to not incur miasma and purification, pollution, to remain or to try and maintain a level of purification. I hesitate to say to maintain purity, because you cannot maintain purity, but purification, the process of purifying, is something that you can maintain. Now I just want to speak more on the purification methods which I practice, and the practices and phenomena that I recognize as formal catharsis, and how they foster intimacy with the gods. And when I say katharsis for each of these, I mean it in the sense of purification and cleansing, either before a theurgic rite or something that, like as in kind of the formal sense, but also, very much so also, spontaneously, kind of when I have a pent-up pollution, pent-up miasma, pent-up trauma, pent-up emotions, pent-up grief, and that needs to be released, and spontaneously, especially if I'm holding it in for way too long, it just happens. I just enter into a state of katharsis, and sometimes I can lose myself in it. But I'll speak of that later. So although something like the burning of herbs is included in theurgy as a theurgic act, as the act of the sacrifice itself, I'm going to kind of reposition it to be among katharsis, as is a purification, and it's a preparation for theurgy and for prayer, for ritual and for prayer. But that one can be considered, I think, either katharsis or theurgy. But anyway, so I have a small little list here of things that are practices of katharsis. So of course, they range from like very broad, kind of generic, to like kind of specific acts. But in general, just grieving is a katharsis. And you see this in Homer. Homer is, I've said it before and I'll say it until I die, which is that Homer is the greatest teacher of grief, especially, I would say, both Iliad and Odyssey, but surprisingly, Odyssey is such a treatise of grief and how to grieve exquisitely, how to grieve beautifully, how to grieve like one of the godlike Mycenaean heroes, you know? But grieving is definitely a katharsis. And I'll probably make, honestly, a separate video on grief and katharsis. Bathing, of course. Bathing is katharsis. Bathing the feet, cleaning the feet, washing the hands, using salt, scrubbing, exfoliation is a katharsis. It's making contact with the impurity and releasing it. Abstaining from substances is a katharsis. It's absolutely katharsis. The burning of herbs is katharsis. Extended periods of intentional conscious isolation and silence is katharsis. This is very Christian coded. It's very like desert hermit coded, but that's okay. I mean, I've said this before, and I don't like to draw like attention to kind of our post-Christian mystical consciousness, but I think that at some level we have to admit that we're living in the 21st century, that we will always have a kind of post-Christian understanding of mysticism and religious consciousness, and that's okay, even if we are trying to return to a much more ancient religious system of prayer and communion with the gods, an older form than Christianity. We are still kind of in a post-Christian world. So yeah, the extended periods of intentional conscious silence, like isolation, hermitude, I think those periods are definitely a form of katharsis. They're a form of purification. Abstaining from social media, kind of along the same lines, is a katharsis. It's a purification. It's kind of like a passive one. Processing trauma and meditating specifically for the purpose of processing trauma, which is one of my favorite things to do ever. is definitely a catharsis, because the emotions come up. Like, you make contact with the impurity. That's what it means when I say when you make a contact with an impurity, is you make contact, you see the emotion, you make contact with it, and there's movement, like it's dynamic, like there is something that takes place psycho-spiritually. If you're a woman, of course, menstruation is literally a catharsis. Like, menstruation menstruation is literally a way for your body to grieve once a month. And it is a release. It is like literally your body, your womb, your life force as a female human being cleansing itself. And it is an enormously important catharsis. And menstruation is a period of time which should be and which was ritually observed throughout history. It's really only in the modern era, like industrialization, that menstruation was kind of like that women who were menstruating were forced to go into the world, because it's really a period of grief. Every time a woman is undergoing menstruation, like, we've all experienced it, that our hormones are changing, our emotions are becoming visible, they're coming out of hiding. There are things that are coming out of hiding, that are becoming unhidden, that we're cleansing ourselves from. And then finally, my favorite form of catharsis, maybe you already guessed, is bathing in the sea. And there's just nothing like it. There's just nothing like it. And it's I think it's like the most interesting form of catharsis, because often when I spend many hours, when I spend a whole day sea bathing, I inevitably end up grieving and undergoing lots of other forms of catharsis. It's really interesting. And I think what's most interesting about the sea bathing method of catharsis is that you are being cleansed and purified by the entire body of conscious life, which gave birth to all life on earth. So you're being cleansed by everything in the world, everything in the earthly world, in a sense. The source of everything that has ever lived on earth, the water. So you're being purified, and this is kind of, not gonna lie, this was my intended apotheosis of this podcast episode, was that when you're sea bathing, you are being cleansed not by a sterile body of water, not by water which has no bacteria, nothing in it, mineral water. No. You're being cleansed by everything that has ever lived on earth. You're being cleansed by the source of life on earth. The sea, the water, the Ur consciousness. You're being cleansed by the original consciousness of planet Earth. Now, I wanted to move on to saying something which is not very clinical, because I am neither a scientist nor a philosopher. I'm just an intuitive kind of woman, I guess, and I think most people are in desperate need of catharsis. I think that most people on the planet Earth are walking around with impurities accumulated, just walking around the world, even the dream world, with all of this miasma, all of this pollution accumulated in you. Some of it was your own doing, a lot of it was not. A lot of it was not your own doing, but all of it pollution, nonetheless. It doesn't matter. It's indiscriminate that you're just walking around emitting this pollution. And maybe you're wondering, why are the gods fleeing from me? Why? Why I, an uncleansed entity? Why the gods flee from me? Because they're repulsed by pollution. How can the gods approach an entity which has done no purification? So if you're wondering, if that's you, And you're wondering why. Why do I approach the gods and they flee? Because you have so much you need to purify yourself of and cleanse and release, but you have to make contact with the impurity. Like, you have to experience it again, right? You don't take a shower with clothes on. You take a shower after you've denuded, after you've removed whatever would get in the way between your body and your cleansing. So you have to do it. You have to do this. You have to make contact with the wounds. You have to like re-experience them, re-traumatize yourself kind of to heal correctly, like the bone or whatever, you know, it needs to heal correctly. You need to make contact with the impurity. You can't just do it in an intellectual way. That's not how it works. That's not how the unconscious, the dream world works. You have to re-experience the original wound viscerally. You have to realize the emotion through the body, the sensations at the time of the first impact. And if you can do it in front of another person, it's even better. In front of a trusted confidant, someone who's capable of like acknowledging this process and this pollution, someone who will not view you as a monster, but rather instead as someone who's doing something extraordinarily noble in cleansing oneself, in cleansing yourself. Because as I said, most people in the world are just walking around with miasma, with their pollution just accumulating on their body, SMH, and they're trying to work in the conscious realm. They're desperately trying their best to like recalibrate their conscious behaviors and thoughts. It's like, I have to stop behaving like this. Every single morning they wake up, I have to change this behavior. I have to stop indulging this addiction. I have to stop behaving this way. But they can't, because they're trying to heal their unconscious with their conscious. It's absurd. It doesn't even make sense. And I don't, to be honest, just to get a little bit of opinion, I don't even understand the aversion to reaching deep down into the underworld to cleanse, because I love it. I love doing catharsis. I love like re-experiencing my trauma to cleanse myself of it. And this may be because I have kind of like a line of communication with the underworld and with the dead. It's not scary to me anymore. It's not something that I ever like consciously invoke, literally ever. This is a totally separate discussion. I'm going to make another episode about the nether world and the dead in the depths, but I'm also kind of speaking more in the sense of the subconscious. But katharsis is like reaching down into the underworld, into the depths, literally below the earth, the under earth, the under self, under the conscious self. And that is where we are reaching our hand and scrubbing, making contact, acknowledging that there is an impurity, scrubbing it, releasing it, washing it away. There's some Sufi quotation. I don't know where it's from. I completely forget where it's from, but it's very beautiful. It's like, water says to the unclean one, come here. The unclean one says, I am so ashamed. And the water says, but how will you ever be made clean without me? And the thing about katharsis is that it's again, as I've said, it's a process of continuous purification. You don't just shower once in your entire life and then you never shower again. You shower every day. Hopefully you shower in regular intervals. You shower habitually. So katharsis is a habit. It's a habitual practice. It requires a trusted confidant, and it's not easy to find, by the way. That's like another element to the deep katharsis, is finding a confidant to witness the katharsis. Really deep katharsis. I'm talking about like re-experiencing really deep childhood trauma, even ancestral trauma, cosmic trauma. Best witnessed. And it's not easy to find. If you have one, then you're lucky. You're very fortunate. But a lot of people don't. So they try to purify by themselves. And it is purification. I mean, when you purify by yourself, it is definitely a more comfortable way of purifying. But I don't know if I can say it's complete or not. I'm not an authority to say whether or not a katharsis is complete, if it's witnessed or not witnessed. But I know that like ancient Greek women and Greek people would communally mourn the dead, and so did most other human civilizations for the vast majority of history. And specifically, Greek women would like cut their hair or tear their clothes. They would wail loudly, tear at their faces. They would smear ashes on themselves in front of others, in front of their community members. So this grief was communal. It was like really re-experiencing the very scary, very horrific, visceral experiences of being a human being with other human beings. It was communal, and it has always been. It's really only a recent modern phenomenon for grief to be like so private. So we have to connect to others in our wounds, connect to their wounds too. Again, this is like advanced catharsis. And try to heal. But we're never going to heal perfectly though, right? Like it'll be always a little crooked. Always a little crookedness will cause us to behave in ways that make us suffer, right? To behave erratically or self-destructively in gradations, in ways that also sometimes hurt others. But we minimize the pollution. Again, we minimize through this katharsis. I am someone who has accrued incredible pollution in my life. Incredible things that I am very ready and willing to speak about to people who I know and love. I'm not yet ready to speak about in public, but incredible pollution. And if it weren't for all the catharsis that I have done, I would have behaved in even more destructive and erratic ways than I already have. As a human being. And I want to say something very earnest and vulnerable and from the heart, which is that catharsis is literally like heartbreaking. Like catharsis on a personal level, making contact with the tragic things which have befallen you personally, cosmically, ancestrally, but primarily personally, the things in life which have named you. This is heartbreak. I don't know what else to call it. It is heartbreak. It's heartbreaking. But as you keep doing it, you keep repeating the steps, you keep exploring different forms of it, you will become stronger. I mean, I don't know, maybe you have to do it indefinitely, maybe not. Maybe there comes a time when you can face the most painful, even the most evil things that have happened to you with a kind of twinge of a memory and just say to yourself, that's all over now. But I suppose. But for a lot of us, we're still trying to figure it out, I suppose. But I can't even say what a sufficient catharsis is. I can only kind of speak about my own experiences with catharsis, which this was a much more kind of like, this was a less personal explication. I want to record another episode in which I speak about my instances of catharsis. But I think that there's a secret to catharsis, which is that the gods are always kind of standing by. And again, I think that like the best catharsis is like deep catharsis with a witness. But if you don't have that, the gods are waiting to receive your catharsis, should you want them to. There are ways for you to record your catharsis, to re-experience the things that you need to re-experience so that you can acknowledge them, make contact with them, strip them off, and wash them away from yourself. And catharsis is an exercise of our individual wills, because catharsis is this conscious purification of subconscious pollution, impurities, trauma, etc. Now I'm going to end with some discussion of the sea. Of course, I'm a supplicant of Poseidon. I think of everything. I think of everything theological in terms of the sea. And I think of many of the divine elements in my own life. I think of them in terms of the sea, and I hold deep aquatic significances in kind of my own appraisal of my own life and many of my spiritual activities and mechanisms. I think most people, when they go to the sea and they bathe in the sea for like a long time, and I used to love just spending 8 hours at the sea. I think most people, when they go to the sea, I say I used to, I still enjoy doing this. I still do this, of course. I do this literally whenever I can. I'm an adult now, so I have other responsibilities. Can't spend as many hours straight, but I think that most people, when they go to the sea, they feel they've been truly cleansed and washed. And again, like I said, there's an amazing quality which the sea has, aside from just its saltiness and the water and the harsh friction upon our bodies, which exfoliates us. It exfoliates our souls and our spirits. And again, as I said, it is the fact that the sea contains all of life. It is literally a divine body of water out of which all life on earth crawled. So the sea contains all of human life, all of conscious life, all of animal life. It is the most ancient living aspect of the earth. It precedes every other living element on earth. It is extraordinarily ancient, and accordingly it is very powerful. And so it is salty, but it is not sterile. It has everything in it. It is kind of the antithesis of like a sterile, clean body, because it has all of life. So the fact that all of life is washing over us, and the waves, and it's hitting our body and whipping us around, and the wind and the sun, and that is how we cleanse ourselves and heal and feel purified, by being washed over by this body which has everything in it. I think that this speaks to a kind of spiritual disposition that we should be tending to in ourselves. To feel everything that we need to feel and experience, and to allow the mass of all life to like wash over us at all times, not at all times, but when we need to, in the moments of katharsis, to understand and realize that this is how we will emerge as a purified spirit and a purified body, by presently, soberly, lucidly receiving that mass of all life. The gods ordained it so that humans would feel this very profound and significant divine effect of the purifying agent of the sea. There is a deep metaphysical order in these things. So, anyway, thank you, Poseidon, for the revelations, for the illuminations. That is all for my first episode on Katharsis. This was a long one, so if you made it to the end, congratulations. You are very blessed, you are very patient, and you are sure to live a blessed life. Probably make some more episodes in the series. I have lots of things to say. I wrote this many months ago, but rereading it all kind of now, like my notes, my little bullet points, it's like kind of re-experiencing some interesting thoughts. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time. May you be blessed eternally.